I know younger than 14.
Okay, now 14 is good.
Yeah, that'd be great. Well, you're gonna have to add something to that.
Sure, sure.
What you willing to add to that too? Just talk to me.
Well, like I said, this is my first time out.
You know, now you.
So the girls over there cost 2, is that
That's the women.
the woman?
Now, if I told you 2, and you want something younger, I tell you to add something to it. Just tell me you just pick a figure up to that.
Well, I guess 3.
3. 3. You got it.
Thank you.
He definitely just beat us, like probably stump you out, like stump you, like when you're on the ground, physically stump you. Yeah. He'll probably hit you with a belt, physically slap you, punch you.
He would beat me with broomsticks, handles. He'd burn me with candles. He would take metal hangers and beat me with them, poke me with them, belts, anything that he can get his hands on, he would beat me with. The one time he had beat me so bad that he had ruptured my spleen and it put me in the intensive care unit. So it's like once you knew that he could almost kill you, you'd rather do what he says than to get beat again.
If you come in, that'd be like 150. Okay. They come to you alcohol, that'd be like 200. Okay. Now I got hotel room, so that's yeah, that's okay. So 200 each. Yeah, an hour. Okay. So I'll give you 400. Okay, I give him 200. I give it to you. Okay, so I'll give you 400, and then we can tip the girls whatever on top of that. But is that all right with you?
Hello, I run all this. Yeah, these my girls.
Oh, okay.
They don't do nothing. Look pretty.
We're all under 18. We're all the same age. There would be a few girls that I knew that were like in their 20s or whatever, but they had been doing it since they were our age anyways. I did wait till 12, and these girls were doing it since they're like 8 or 9, and now they're like 23.
I want to show them and tell them like what it feel like to be that hoe, to be degraded all the time, to be hit on, to be manipulated, to be sold all day, every day. Who was there to stop it? Nobody was there to stop
Shared Hope International is one of the organizations that deals with this internationally, and a lot of the videos that you find on YouTube are from Shared Hope, and they're a little hard to watch. I have had a hard time over the years trying to find videos that I can show that aren't so hard for people to watch, but that was obviously a police sting. And it was just an example of what happens on the streets all day, every day. So one of the things that we have seen over the time that I've been studying this problem is that the amount of dollars that pour into this industry every year change. And by the way, I've moved you guys over to the side so I cannot see you. But if you have anything that you want to say, just unmute and feel free to jump in. I don't mind that at all. When we first started looking at this, we thought that if you would ask a group of people in a training, where do you think this is happening? They would always say things like Thailand or Africa or China. But it's really here. The United States is really the #1 destination around the world for people who want to have sex with kids. And if people didn't want to have sex with kids, we wouldn't have this problem. But the last time I checked the stats on this, because I have to update this every time I do this, there were about 300 100,000 kids in the United States being held in human trafficking. Now that number could be higher now. I really don't know because I probably checked this a year ago. And probably I checked the amount of the dollar figure about 2 months ago. And at that point, it was the second largest illegal trade for organized crime. It's a $150 billion industry every single year. When I first started doing this, the very first, because I saved all the trainings that I've done over the years, it was a $35 billion industry. And then it jumped to 50, and then it jumped to 100. And the last time I checked it, it was $150 billion. The only larger illegal trade for organized crime is the heroin industry. But what is the difference? What can you do with people? You can sell them over and over again. And that's really why the gangs have gotten into it. And probably the last 10 years, gangs have gotten involved in the sex trades, and why? It's very lucrative. It's a lot of money. Drugs can be sold once, but you can sell a girl or a boy that you're holding in human trafficking multiple times a day. And if you watch some of the videos, and you can find tons of them on YouTube, sometimes kids talk about having to do 20 tricks a day. They're given drugs to stop their periods. They are beaten if they don't meet their quotas. So once you are into they call it the life, once you're in the life, the average time for kids to be in the life and be able to get out is 8 years. And that's a long time. Gangs have become very involved with sex trafficking in the last several years. But what do we know about gangs? We know that girls are not a part of the gang. Girls think they're a part of the gang, but they're not. Girls are sexed into the gang. Boys are beaten into the gang. But one of the things that gang members initially do, and all pimps do this, is to make their girls feel like they're welcomed and that they're valued, and they aren't. Girls in gangs are used exclusively for human trafficking. They are not used for anything else, and they are not a part of the gang. And if you are working with somebody that has come in through gang-related sex trafficking, it's something that you've really got to keep in mind, that a lot of these girls thought that they were valued. Most of them come from broken homes. Most of them come from the foster care system, and they think that they are valued, and they are not. So who's at the greatest risk to be trafficked? Most of you know that I have spent time at Florida United Methodist Children's Home, and I can tell you that I was there in 2015 and 2016, and I was absolutely amazed at how naive residential care is about this. That there were at night, they're always in white vans, these guys, and they would circle the children's home and try to lure some of the kids to get out into the street so that they could run away with them. Now, obviously, kids that are in residential care are there because something bad has happened to them. So it was very easy for some of these kids to get lured into the sex trades. That particular campus has no fences around it. It's an open campus, and these kids could take off through the woods over onto Providence Avenue, and some of them were never seen again. So kids in foster care are really the greatest risk to be trafficked. So we know who we're working with. The victims of childhood sexual abuse, if you have experienced childhood sexual abuse, it's the biggest indicator of being trafficked. One of the things I used to try to tell the childcare staff at the children's home is that 1 out of every 3 teens is going to be lured into the sex trade within 48 hours when they run away. And we saw that happen over and over, where these kids would run away, and if you didn't find them, they would find their way up to Daytona Beach or someplace equally difficult, and they would be gone. And there were kids many kids, and I don't think it's just the children's home, I think it's in all residential facilities, that kids run away and they're never retrieved because they are very, very vulnerable to be lured into the sex trade. And the average age is 12 to 14. You heard that girl on the video say she waited till she was 9. Boys a little bit older, but there's equally amount of boys in the sex trade. And the LGBTQ population is very, very vulnerable to this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute.
So I have a question. I don't know if you would know. The kids are in this age range. What ends up happening when they turn 18? Do they end up turning it up, or they just graduate from that into just working in the streets?
Well, a lot of them do. Yeah, I mean, think about it, Stephen. It's all sometimes by the time these kids get to be 18, this is all they know. The difference, and we'll talk about the Safe Harbor Act a little bit further on in the training. You cannot arrest a child under 18 for prostitution, but before the Safe Harbor Act, they were arrested. So they were arrested all the time. They were arrested for prostitution. They were arrested for stealing. And by the time they got to be 18, they didn't know, most of them don't know any difference about what this life is. It's a whole, it's just a whole brainwashing type of thing that goes on. So what you'll see, if you watch any of the videos about the police doing the stings, sometimes when they do a sting, like at a Super Bowl event or a NASCAR event, and they try to go into the hotels and rescue these girls, a lot of them don't realize that they need rescuing, which is what makes the treatment of these kids very, very difficult. But yeah, I think a lot of them just stay because that's what they know. They don't have anybody else. This is their, quotes, their family. The lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, all of these are very overly represented in the sex trades. And why? We know, because we've been talking a lot about this, and clearly it's being talked about in the news right now in Florida, is that a lot of these kids are rejected by their families. So especially for trans kids, they're more likely to be homeless. They're more likely to be on the street. A lot, especially boys. Boys are much more apt to think that they are selling their bodies in order to survive. And again, that makes them believe that they are not, they're not victims, that they're in charge of their own destiny, that their family has kicked them out, they're on the street, they have no way to eat, so they sell their bodies. Once you begin to do survival sex, then it's very easy for somebody to manipulate you, to take you over, to become your pimp. And then it's really hard to get out. I don't know, this mouse is not helping me at all today. Let me try that other mouse. Hold on, technical difficulties as usual. Should have seen Lisa and I here yesterday trying to get this sound to work. I was swearing. If we didn't have technical difficulties, we wouldn't have anything to do. So how do these kids get trafficked? This is a very, very organized activity. I would not suggest that you do this, but there are websites that offer guides as to how pimps can identify victims and find them. And it isn't hidden. This is an organized crime activity. And obviously there are people who pimp out their kids for money too, and that's the sad truth, and we see that. But this is organized crime. This isn't just some guy looking to make a buck. Backpage has been shut down. When I first started doing this, Backpage was where everybody sold their kids. And Backpage did cooperate with the investigations, and Backpage has been shut down since that time. But if you go on, when I show you the DCF workers PowerPoint, she identifies hundreds of apps that are now being used that have taken the place of Backpage. So the primary way that these kids get recruited into the trafficking system is now through the apps. And since the pandemic, since kids were at home, since kids were in their bedrooms and their parents weren't seeing what they were doing, it really, really increased the amount of kids that were brought into sex trafficking through social media. Actually, this is a quote from pimppete.com. The most important thing is to keep a girl, tell her story, learn what went wrong, and play off it, and convince them that you love them and you won't have to keep them in check. The initial MO for a pimp recruiting a kid into sex trafficking is usually to pretend to be the boyfriend. And again, these are very vulnerable kids. You have a guy who's a little bit older, he spots you on the beach, he can tell by looking at you that you're in trouble. Look at the kids when you look around, even in a high school class, you can tell the kids that are experiencing difficulty and the kids that aren't. But when we see these guys spotting somebody, Daytona Beach is a great place to find kids that are going to be trafficked, because who's out there looking at them? Pimps are looking for them. And once they have identified them, they're going to take them out to eat. They're going to buy them some clothes. Maybe they'll get their hair done. They're going to convince these kids that they are loved. And once that happens, then there's a very predictable path to what happens after that. Once you have a kid who is now beholden to you because he or she thinks that you love them, then you say, look, I got something you can do for me. I bought you all these clothes. I bought you food. I've had your hair done. I've had your nails done. Now, what are you going to do for me? You can do something for me. And that's how it starts. And then, as you heard those girls say at the beginning, once you get past that stage and you have now said to your victim, you have to do this for me. Then if a girl or a boy says no, that's when the other stuff happens. That's when the beatings happen. That's when the torture happens. They're not allowed to eat. They're not allowed to sleep. They're plied with drugs. And it isn't all, what was that movie with Liam Neeson? Taken. It's not all taken. Liam Neeson did nothing for the world of human trafficking by putting those Taken movies together, because he made it look very glamorous, and it wasn't glamorous. And his daughter in that movie was also older, but it really did kind of show that I will give this much to Taken, that in the very first movie, they were alone in a strange country, in a strange city. And there were a couple of girls who looked kind of confused, and they looked alone, and they were approached by a couple of guys who invited them to a party. And that's how all of that happened. More often than not, it is the kid that is a victim of some kind of sexual abuse, foster kids, kids that have had difficulties in their home life, that are much more apt to have that happen to them. I can also tell you that the attempts of sex traffickers to pick kids up at the children's home in Enterprise, Florida, which is probably a town of 5,000 people, got so obvious that these guys would pull into the parking lot and try to get over the gate to try to get at these kids. And it worked for a lot of them. And again, I don't think that was just there. I think it happens in all group homes. So let me move you guys over again. Recruiting kids online has become the primary source of bringing kids in. It didn't used to be. Even 6-7 years ago, it was a lot more face-to-face. But the pandemic, I mean, what happened during the pandemic? We all went online. And a lot of kids were alone, and a lot of kids were alone in their rooms. Parents were trying to work from home. It was all just shifted the way we did everything during the pandemic. So Facebook and Instagram, Facebook, which I always thought was the app for old ladies, is the primary source of recruiting for grooming kids now. There's a lot of them. There are hundreds of them. But if you look at those are just some of the ones that we've listed: Mega Personal, Liz Crawler, Skip the Games. They all look like they are adults looking for sex with other adults, but they are not. They're all used by traffickers. A lot of them are developed in China. Many of them are controlled outside of the US. but there are all kinds of ways for kids to get into this. And if you have children at home, if you have teenagers at home, you might find that they will tell you that they have been approached online, and usually with people that they don't even know. And I doubt anybody wants me for human trafficking, but I get approached for Facebook friends by people all the time that I don't even think are real people. So these are kids, and kids are very vulnerable to this type of thing. This is a little clip of social media recruitment. This is on our playlist on our YouTube channel. But what I want you to notice about this is that this girl is not a kid. This girl is not a kid. She's 18. And you see how easily it is for her to get sucked into this.
Hey, Jessica?
Hey, are you Brian?
Yeah, the studio's just a walk away. Do you want to get going?
You really look at your profile picture.
Yeah, that picture's a few years old. But anyway, let's go. Come on.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's how easy it is. Now, I picked that particular video because she is a little bit older. She's 18. She doesn't act dumb. He flattered her. She didn't know who he was. She answered a text from somebody that she didn't know who said she was pretty and offered her a modeling gig, which is another common way to do this. There's a lot of offers of modeling. And if you're a young kid, if you're a kid that's in foster care, if you've been molested, if your parents don't take care of you, if your parents have abandoned you, wouldn't you be flattered by somebody that came to you and said, how would you like to be a model? How would you like to be in my movie? You're beautiful. It's a very, very common way to get kids to get sucked in. How did she get sucked in? She got sucked in because she was flattered. And he then had all of these other names popping in saying, you're beautiful, I love your picture. Now she thinks all these people are following her and all these people are looking at her picture and saying how beautiful she is. And then when he says, you have to pay me back for these clothes, she said, I didn't know. Nobody ever said anything about this. And that's how she got sucked in. That's a pretty common scenario. Nobody is immune to this, but kids such as our kids, the kids that we work with, are just 100% more vulnerable than the average kid. So why will these kids not self-identify? And they won't. A lot of kids, even if there's an attempt to rescue them, the police attempt to rescue them, a lot of these kids will not self-identify. They will not. They think the pimp is their boyfriend. And we have gotten a lot better at trying to figure this out than we were a few years ago. But one of the common signs, and the police who work cybersecurity and the police who work in human trafficking have gotten a whole lot better at figuring out what to look for with these kids. But one of the common things is that they don't have any identification. Why don't they have identification? That's one of the first things that the pimp is going to take away from them, is any way to identify who they are. And they don't have, they often don't, when I say they don't know what state they're in, you got to remember that these kids get moved from state to state. One of the things that we have learned is that there are the three big states for human trafficking are Florida, Texas, and California. And these kids are kind of moved around. It's like taking them up and down 95. And they follow events. And when we talk about things like NASCAR and Bike Week and all of the things that we have in Florida, Florida has a lot of events that attracts human trafficking. Whenever Florida has a NASCAR or a Bike Week or any big thing that they're going to have, there's going to be an increase of human trafficking. And these kids sometimes don't even know where they are. So they're not going to give you any information. They can't tell you where they are in school. Sometimes they stay in it because they think that their families are going to be hurt, which is another common way to keep kids in line, because the pimp will tell them that I'll kill your mother, I'll kill your brother. We used to say that branding was a very common way to identify a sex trafficked kid. Not so much anymore, because everybody and their brother, except me apparently, has a tattoo. But this used to be a pretty common method of identifying kids that are in human trafficking. The traffickers would have their initials branded into the girls or the boys. This little girl here has a barcode. So it used to be a common way to identify. It is less so now because of the world that we live in. And it has its own lingo. And some of this you know, because we've used some of these in the vernacular for many, many years. But if you are going to work with kids that have been trafficked, it is best for you to learn the lingo. And I certainly don't need to go through it all, but if you are going to work with kids that have been trafficked, you have to look for the language that they use. And certainly, obviously, Johns are buyers. We know what the pimps are, but there's a lot of language in here that you need to know. And you also need to recognize this isn't always men that are doing this. A lot of women traffic kids too. We've had examples of that in Florida. Not that long ago, a woman was arrested in Daytona Beach for pimping out a young girl. The police, I think it was one of those NASCAR stings that they found her. But why was she trafficking young girls? Because she had been trafficked herself. She'd been picked up off the street when she was young. She was involved in human trafficking until she turned 18. She learned how to make some money at it. And again, sometimes it's just the only life that they know. Again, those are just some more of the language that we use. The whole lot lizard thing. Lot lizards, one of the things that you're going to find at truck stops is that these kids will troll the truck stops. And the traffickers will say, well, they'll drop them off at the truck stop and give them a quota. And again, if men didn't want to have sex with kids, we wouldn't have this problem, but they do. And a lot of the truckers would just leave their lights on. And if they leave their lights on, then that's a symbol that they want something. There have also been instances. There was an instance a few years ago where the guy, he was a trucker, he left his lights on, the kid got in the cab, and he asked her how old she was. She was 16, and he had a 16-year-old daughter. So he asked her if she was there of her own free will, if she wanted to do this. And for a miracle, she told him the truth, and he called the police, and she was rescued that way. But more than likely, that's not going to happen. So when I say what do these kids look like, I mean, these kids have gone through a lot. When we first started looking at safe houses, there was actually a safe house in Texas that it was outside of the Austin area. And they were one of the first safe houses in the state of Texas. And they had opened up a safe house, and it was in a rural area. And they had the cooperation of the FBI. They had the cooperation of the local police. They had a lot of security perimeters around there. And even with all of this, the traffickers would often try to get in to get these kids out of there. And the woman who was running it at the time told me that her husband was a lawyer for Homeland Security. And he kept saying to her, this is just too dangerous. This is just too dangerous for you, because these kids were involved in a lot of major crimes. A lot of these kids would be witnesses to major crimes, murders, assaults, drug trafficking. So the FBI would bring them in for testimony. And this woman would have to fly with them to other states to take them to be to testify, which probably was dangerous. But what you have to remember with these kids is that all of these things have happened to them, but they are still kids. And they're kids that really don't always understand what's happening to them. It's very hard to get out of the sex industry once you get in it. And before the Safe Harbor Act, they were considered prostitutes, even if they were 9 or 10. So the Safe Harbor Act has gone a long way towards helping us with this.
Barbara, can I interject?
Sure.
I work in a rehab / mental health program, and I have this, she's 19, cognitive delayed, and she was trafficked. She was, I don't know how, the details of it, but I know that she was trafficked. And I just want to mention that, they really took advantage of someone who couldn't defend herself, that could not, she wasn't even aware what's going on. But they, for some reason, groomed her so well that she, I guess, went into a psychosis episode, and she was like, he's calling me, I need to leave. And so for me, it was like a rude awakening, even though, we've been talking, I've been trained for years about human trafficking, but it's just that, they're like their mentality on the victims that they choose to do this to.
Yeah, it's a really dark business. It really is. And as Jennifer says, once you're there, it's hard to know what your reality is. With a lot of these kids, they don't see anybody else except either the people that are having sex with them or their pimps. It's not like they're not going to school. They don't have identification. They're not allowed to do anything other than have sex with Johns. So after a while, their world becomes very blurred. The pimp controls what they eat. He controls what they drink. He controls how much they sleep or don't sleep. If they are menstruating, he can force them, or she can force them to take medication to stop their menstrual cycle. Because let's face it, if you're menstruating, you're not going to make any money for them. So one of the things that we've identified as being able to identify human trafficking victims is the fact that their periods have stopped, and that they have a lot of obviously syphilis, sexual transmitted diseases, and so forth. But there's a lot of damage to a girl's body by doing some of the things that are forced upon these kids. So we know a lot more about this than we used to. And we certainly have seen, we live in an area where you are going to, you're going to see a lot of opportunity for sex trafficking. Every time there's a major event in Daytona Beach, such as, or Tampa, when Tampa had did Tampa have the Super Bowl there a year or so ago? You can see massive efforts now by law enforcement. It's a very studied way to deal with this problem now, because what happens before any of the Super Bowl events, any of the events up in Daytona Beach, any of the NASCAR events, is that the hotel workers are trained to spot this. The hotel workers in any of these big venues are trained to see whether or not there are girls being driven up in cars, whether there are a steady stream of men going in and out. They're trained to look for kids who do not check themselves into the hotel, but are checked in by perhaps a guy that they don't appear to know. And they are not given any kind of identification, and they don't pay for anything themselves. So one of the things that hotel workers have been very instrumental in is cooperating in these stings. Over the years, we've just learned a whole lot more about this than we knew before, which is why I say, don't look at Liam Neeson and Taken. This has just evolved into a very, very big business.
May I interject again? I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, Jennifer. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, in the past, I think that in the past they had like a profile of the kids that they wanted. They had identified kids that had problems at home, or they had identified kids in foster care. But I was just trying to educate one of my clients in human traffic and how she could be one. I was just educating her and open her eyes into this is real, this could happen. And I was playing one of the videos that you had in your playlist, and how this old lady was being used to lure young ladies into this world, and how she would spray them trying to test a perfume, and the perfume was something that would put her to sleep, and they would grab her and put her in a car. So they're no longer looking for a profile, they're just looking for anyone. And so that's a more scary thought.
It's a scary thing. It is very scary. And I don't have children at home anymore. And if I did, I think I would be very frightened for raising young children. These kids are, and it isn't just the kids in foster care, but since we got into all the social media recruitment during the pandemic, anybody can be approached. The girl Jessica in this video is just, she thinks she's being approached by all these guys telling her how beautiful she is. And in fact, she still isn't smart enough when she turns around and says, you don't look like your picture, to say maybe this isn't a real person. But it's very easy. It's much easier than one might think to get sucked into this. The Super Bowl stings are pretty interesting. Before the pandemic, we were going to the Human Trafficking Summit every year. They were holding it in Tampa, and law enforcement always presented their stings, and they would always present how they did things. The Super Bowl stings are really big business now, and they did a sting at the one in Tampa. There's a whole, it might be in our playlist, I'm not sure. A whole video of the law enforcement officer that was in charge of that sting, talking about how they did this, and the media is a big part of it, and social media is a big part of it. That they have ways to track where some of these guys are coming from, where some of these traffickers are coming from, where they're bringing the girls from. And usually it's more often at these events, it's more often girls than boys, but boys are equally involved in this. But what we found over the years is that the training for the hospitality industry is absolutely, what is Marcia saying?
Some Uber drivers have been caught trying to take kids.
Oh, Marcia. Oh, Marcia, I didn't even know you were here. Marcia
Good
says
morning.
some Uber drivers have been caught attempting to take passengers, boys or girls. Yeah, they have. There's all kinds of ways for this to happen now. And we have had, since Marcia mentioned that, the Uber drivers and the other, those offline cab drivers are, if they are willing to cooperate in the stings, they are brought in and trained for the stings. Certainly the people that work in the hotels are trained. The taxi drivers are trained. And they've been very instrumental in bringing some of this down. Like I said, we've learned a whole lot more about this than we used to know. We've had to learn a whole lot more about this than we used to know. Hold on, I never know where this ends. Oh, there it is. This isn't limited to gender, race, or anything else. However, I think we have to recognize that the #1 factor in becoming a human trafficking victim is going to be childhood sexual abuse. For one thing, think about it. If you are a child victim of sexual abuse, you have been trained from a very early age that this is what is expected of you. You've been trained at a very early age that this is what people expect you to do. So it isn't as much of a stretch for the trafficker to kind of suck you in. Recruiters and victims, 54% were strangers and 46% are known to each other. So what does that mean? That means that 46% of recruiters are people that you know. It might be your boyfriend, it might be your mother, it might be your father. We have had a lot of instances of families selling their kids for sex, and that's the sad truth. Rachel Lloyd has written a book called Girls Like Us. She was a human trafficking victim. She identified herself actually as a prostitute because she was trafficked, and it trafficked before a time when we looked at these kids as victims. So when we say 70 to 90% of women in the sex industry were abused before they got into the sex industry, if you really look at that, that really means that there's very few people that are in this industry that did not start out as victims. But this is a quote from her book. For girls who have experienced incest, sexual abuse, or rape, the boundaries between love, sex, and pain become blurred. Sexual abuse lays the groundwork. The pimp, the trafficker, doesn't need to do much training because it's already been done by her father, her uncle, her mother's boyfriend, or teacher. She's well prepared for what is to come. That is a really hard book to read. But as with a lot of the people that you see that will go into the lecture circuit, they are often kids that have been trafficked, who've gotten out, who've been rescued, who receive successful treatment and are willing to use their experiences to see if they can help others. And Rachel Lloyd is one of those people. So 13 years really is the average age for sex trade. Although you did hear one of those girls say she said she waited till she was 9. But the last stats that I had were over 300,000 kids are being held as sex slaves. It's probably higher now because I don't think I've run that for a while. And truthfully, every time I run it, it gets higher. So what time is it? All right. Let me do the group home thing and then we'll take a break. When I talk to you about my experiences at Florida United Methodist Children's Home, it is a very obvious place for recruitment. And I say that about all group homes and all residential centers, that I watched this. I watched kids being allowed by their pimps to go into group homes so that they could recruit other kids. And it was very obvious that they were doing it. The group homes that are here in Deltona, I think are gone now. Choices and Unity House, they're gone, aren't they? I think they closed down. There were a couple of small group homes they would call it, one of them was Choices, one of them was Unity House. They were in Deltona. They were, I forget, I don't even know who ran them, but they were small. And as with a lot of group homes, they didn't have a lot of very well-trained staff. And what would happen is that these kids would get into these group homes and they would disappear on weekends. They would be gone all weekend. They would come back. It would be very obvious where they had been. They would come back with money. They would come back with their hair done. They would come back with their nails done. They would come back looking like, you know, they had been involved in this all weekend, but they would then glorify it to the other kids in the group home and say, look at my nails, look at my hair. My pimp did that for me this weekend. They would usually refer to it as my boyfriend did that for me this weekend. And a lot of these kids got recruited out of the group homes. And the staff were completely unaware of it. I remember taking one of them as a client and when we were over in Deltona, and the case manager, who was also unaware of this, put in a referral for this kid to have therapy. And the therapist came to me and said, she's very obviously being trafficked. She leaves every weekend. And then the other girls in the group home would tell the therapist that she comes back smelling like sex. And very concerned about this girl. But one weekend she disappeared and she did not come back. And that's usually what happens. This kid had a cell phone. She was outside. The child care staff told the therapist that she was outside in the backyard having conversations with people that they didn't know, with unknown adults, and they didn't stop her because they didn't see it as a red flag. She would leave on the weekends wearing very provocative clothing. And again, this was an untrained staff, and they didn't see what was happening right in front of them. But the other girls would tell the therapist that this kid would try to get them to come with them. There have been a few that I have known that disappeared and never came back. And that's a pretty sad story, including some of the ones that I worked with that I would try to tell the staff at the group home, you've got to watch this. You've got to be aware of this. If you suddenly find her with a burner phone and she's talking to somebody, aren't you even the little slightest bit concerned about who she's talking to? But they just weren't aware. So it's an unlikely source of recruitment, but it's definitely there. So if you are working with kids that are in group homes, you need to be aware of that. You need to be aware of anybody that your client might say, look, she's gone every weekend. I don't know where she goes, but she comes back and she looks like she's had her hair done or whatever. You need to be aware of that. You as therapists have got to be a lot more vigilant about looking for the signs that your kids are being approached, that maybe somebody's trying to approach them on social media, that maybe somebody else in the group home is trying to approach them. And I can tell you that once you are aware of it, you're going to see what was right in front of you all along and that you hadn't noticed it. So who are these kids and who is helping them? Not really very many people. We have, in the beginning of this movement, it was all grassroots organizations. Probably 10 years ago, it was churches. It was grassroots organizations. Domestic violence shelters were the ones who were kind of stepping in and trying to help, but there was no organization. There was no, well, for one thing, there was no protocol into how we were going to help these kids. And it was before we had the task force that we have now. Now, if there's any event coming, like a NASCAR or whatever, most communities have task force, and that would be law enforcement. It would be DJJ, DCF, It might be an organization like ours. It might be an agency like ours that have a representative. But the task force are very organized now. They have representatives from all parts of the service community. They have services waiting for these kids when they're rescued. That was not the case 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were still arresting them. So before we get into the next part of this, if you have been working in this field for a while, there is still a public perception that these kids are choosing this life because the average person on the street just doesn't know that much about this. So first we had to change the perceptions of law enforcement and service providers, and then we had to change the perceptions of the public. So the Safe Harbor Act that we're going to get into in a little bit is what started that. But prior to the Safe Harbor Act, which I think was passed in 2013, there was a very common perception that these were just little prostitutes. There was no understanding of how these kids got into this situation. Think of when you first heard the expression human trafficking. It probably was within the last 10 years. And yet this problem has been going on for centuries. So, okay, we're going to take 10 minutes, come back at 10:15, and we will get started.
This conference will now be recorded.
Can do it again when she's in hair and makeup, but she did really good. Okay, you guys, I think we can get started. Okay, while we were on the break, Lisa looked up our playlist on the YouTube channel, and we have a playlist for human trafficking. And what we did, besides some of the other stuff that's in there, is that all of the workshops that we went to at the Human Trafficking Conference, we posted on that playlist, so you can look at any of them. And the case studies, the one from Ohio, there was a case study from Ohio. The case studies are really interesting because the case studies talk, one of them is a prosecutor talking about how she prosecuted a case that went across state lines, which is difficult. And I forget what the other one was, but the one that you might find helpful is called questions and answers on Q&A on sex trafficking from April of 2020. And that is Marina Anderson. She's the Department of Children and Family spokesperson. And she's usually the one, she does all the lectures and the workshops on gangs. She's really knowledgeable about gangs. And she does all the workshops and the lectures about human trafficking. But she also, if you look at it, you'll be amazed because she talks about all the different apps that traffickers use now that are disguised as different things. So kids don't know when they're opening up some of these apps that they're really being recruited. They don't know that this is not, the person on the other end is not who they think it is. But she also spends a lot of time talking about how to lock your kids' phones and how to check where your kids have been online. So if you want a little tutorial and how to keep your kids safe on social media, she's your girl.
So I have a question. I don't know if you know this, but like, has the trafficking aspect, has it increased since the internet?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, Stephen, it's just made it easier because before, if you think about before we had all of this, how would a pimp find a kid? When I talk about Daytona Beach is the runaway capital of the United States. So if you're going to run away, you're going to run up to Daytona Beach and you're going to have trained eyes looking to see that you look vulnerable, you look poor, you look scared, you look tired. So you had to actually see them and be there. You had to recruit them in the malls, on the beaches, in different sporting events, in entertainment events. But think of how easy it is to go on those apps and pose as a 13-year-old girl or a 14-year-old girl, or a 14-year-old boy. Look at any of those little clips that we have in that playlist. It has made it so easy to recruit kids, and kids that don't even know that they're being recruited until it's over. There's a couple of little clips on that playlist of girls talking about how easy it is for them to get approached by recruiters. One of them said, while you were giving this little speech, I had somebody emailed me and asked me, I forget, to be a model or something. Now, if you're a reasonable kid and you have a good sense of yourself and you have a strong family background and you've got somebody to protect you and you know you have somebody to protect you, you're much more apt to stay away from stuff like that. But if you're vulnerable, if you're needy, if nobody takes care of you, if your parents have failed you, if you have been abused by your parents, it's a lot easier to believe that stuff. It's a lot easier to believe that there is somebody out there that loves me when my own family doesn't. So yeah, I think it's increased 100-fold.
They're recruiting them through video games too,
Right.
online streaming services. Like when kids go on whatever system they have to game,
Right.
they're having those conversations there too.
Yeah, Lisa's sitting behind me, which is why I'm looking that way. But yeah, one of the things that we have talked about a lot is the whole gaming thing. That kids who get on, I mean, there's nothing wrong with gaming, but kids that get on gaming things at night, they can be talking to people all over the world. They don't know who they're talking to. They don't know if the identification of this person is what that person is. Certainly one of the things that one of the task force that I sat on, the cybersecurity cop was talking, he was a member of the task force, was talking about how he had a female, she was a female police officer who had a very youthful sounding voice. So she would get on and line and talk to these guys who said, oh, you're beautiful, you're 14, I'm 15. And in reality, she was talking to a 46-year-old guy who was trying to recruit what he thought was a 14-year-old girl. So there's all kinds of ways that we need to be concerned about our children now.
Are there any like number differences between children that come from a single parent home and how different the numbers are from that to children that have two parents in the home in as far as like the number of trafficking that takes place?
Well, I can only answer that anecdotally because I can't say that I know in particular of any study, but anecdotally, the more risk factors you have, the better your chances of being trafficked. And think of what the risk factors are. Besides being sexually abused, besides being neglected by your parents. I was raised in a single parent home, so all single parent homes are not bad, and let's not say that they are, but there are a lot more vulnerability factors for kids that are in single parent homes. Often there's financial issues, often there's some kind of societal issues, and they're just more vulnerable. So, and again, that doesn't mean that if you are a single parent and you're raising your children alone, that's bad. It's not. But statistically speaking, the more risk factors you have in your life, the better your chance of having something like this happen to you.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm only asking because, like, as a parent, I think it would be good to like look at your circumstances and consider your own risk factors in your own home.
Right.
As far as like the potential of these things going on, and maybe put like make a list, and the bigger that list is, then maybe the more strict we have to be with technology access, because that's really what's I think causing this trafficking. It's really the access to that we didn't have 30 years ago when we had a house phone in the house.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. The more, and that's why I say look at that thing on the playlist, because she pretty much goes over a lot of the risk factors, a lot of the things that you have to be aware of. That even isn't she also the one that did the emojis?
Yeah,
The emojis are scary.
like the language.
The language of emojis, where you might think that you're sending a little smiley face or it's raining in your area, so you're sending a little emoji of rain. These emojis have whole different language meaning for traffickers and for ways of communicating with kids. And it looks very innocent, it looks very simple, but it's a whole different language. So yeah, the more you are aware of what you have or what you need to do to protect your kids, it's a very different world raising children right now. It really is. Lisa mentioned the gaming, and gaming, there's nothing wrong with gaming. But what happened a lot during the pandemic is that kids were bored. They were alone. They were in their homes. They were online. They would get into those gaming sites, and they were lonely. And then you find a 12-year-old boy who's on a gaming site who thinks he's talking to another 12-year-old boy, and he's not. He's talking to a 50-year-old guy who's trying to recruit him. And there's no way to know that. So being aware of where your kids are and what they're doing is pretty important. Way more important than it was a while ago. So,
Something that I've done in the past when I work with, for example, with a kid that I knew was involved in gangs, I would literally have a session or two where I'm learning from the kid and I'm having him teach me all the lingo, all of the words, what everything means. And I would tell him, like, I would be honest with him, like, hey, I just want to learn this from you because you know and I don't. That way I can help other people more. And they would be so willing to give me all the information. They would tell me about all the language, all the new words, because new words come out all the time for all kinds of things.
right. Thank you, Stephen. It's a really good point. I said to Lisa at the break, this is a hard training to do. It's a hard training for me to do because it's very dark. I mean, some of the stuff that we talk about is not quite as dark as this. But you do have to be aware of where your kids are and with whom they are with. And like the whole gaming thing, kids like to game, but now it has a certain aspect of danger to it if you're not aware of it. Bonnie, did you want to say something, or did you just hit your mute button off?
Well, my dog started barking. I was going to say, I had a case when I was working with Michelle, and we had a case of a boy who was in the foster care system, and he just had so many disruptions that he did wind up in a group home in Clearwater. And he had been running away from the group home for days at a time, and they found out that he was hanging out with this female who was supposedly 17 but looked much older. And I really had just that gut feeling like something is not right. He's 13, she's 7, it just didn't make sense. And I really believe that this female girl was luring him for someone else. Away from the group home. And then she actually started including one of his friends in the visits. They would leave. Nobody would know where they went, what they were doing. And thankfully, he was ultimately removed from that group home and moved to another group home. But so I think the role that maybe other people play in luring and helping them lure these kids into these situations, this kid thought this was his girlfriend who was 17, and I just don't think she was. I think she had bad intentions and was under the direction of someone else.
And you're probably right. You probably, if something smells wrong, it probably is wrong. So, I mean, what does a 17-year-old girl want with a 13-year-old boy?
Exactly. Right.
It's kind of, and it goes back to what Stephen was just saying. Something as simple as learning the lingo allows you to understand what is being said. So, watching what kids are doing in group homes, and it's not, I always feel like I'm picking on the Florida United. but it isn't. It's all group homes. I think Lisa made a comment about another group home over in Orlando while we were on the break that has this stuff happen. It's just the situation. It has a lot of very vulnerable kids all together looking for somebody to love them, looking for somebody to take care of them. It's just a breeding ground for recruiting, and recruiters know that. So if you're working with kids in group homes, if you're working with any kind of situations like that, you just need to be really, really aware of that. So thank you both for your comments. I appreciate that. So let's talk about the Safe Harbor Act, because it really has changed the trajectory of what has happened here. Before the Safe Harbor Act was passed in 2013, if there were arrests made, 89% of the people that were arrested were the child victims. The customers were arrested, the pimps were arrested, but 89% were the kids that were being forced into sex. 9% were the Johns, and the other 6% were the pimps. And they were charged with things such as drug possession, mostly prostitution. Most of these kids were charged with prostitution, even though they were underage. And that's why I said it takes a while to change public perception, because up until then, police officers routinely picked these kids up and turned them over to DJJ, and DJJ didn't know what to do with them. So they would end up back in DJJ placements, and they would end up getting running away. A lot of them were mostly running away, and then they would get back on the street. It's got to be this mouse that I'm having all the trouble with. Sorry, I'm talking to myself because my equipment is not working.
I will guess for like 6% of the pimps to be arrested, I mean that nobody's being given up there.
No, no, the kids were arrested, and that really was the trajectory. When Safe Harbor passed, was really the beginning of being able to help these kids. The Safe Harbor Act basically says that minors cannot consent. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. It doesn't matter if they say, I love this guy, he's my boyfriend, I want to be with him, he's not making me do it, I don't mind having sex with guys. You are not, under the law, allowed to consent to prostitution. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are. But again, that's why it's really hard to work with these kids, because many of them are totally feeling like this is a choice that they are making, and it isn't. And now the law says they cannot make that choice anymore. We didn't used to channel them through the Department of Children and Families. We used to channel them through DJJ. So they're arrested and they're channeled through DJJ. Well, what is DJJ? That means that they're a criminal. So they're punished, they're tried, and they're punished. Now we bring them through DCF. And this really was just, this is really an old slide, but this is what these calls used to look like before 2013, before kids were unable to be charged for prostitution. This is a 16-and-a-half-year-old white female. Her parents had lost rights when she was 2. She'd been in foster homes. She'd been sexually abused, adopted at 5, adoption placement at 12, 20 placements for running in residential, frequent runner, numerous attempts for prostitution. Again, this is before 2013. So at 16-and-a-half, this kid had numerous arrests for prostitution. Now, what would happen with these arrests? Who would come and bail these kids out? Usually their pimps. And their pimps were allowed to bail them out. They were allowed to take them. And then usually they never came back for any kind of prosecution. So then you pick this girl up again, and she's also got several warrants for failure to appear. So once they got sucked into the criminal justice system, the whole trajectory of the way they were treated was very, very different. And often, as with this kid, these kids had been involved in serious crimes. Remember, if we're talking about gangs, if we're talking about organized crime, a lot of these kids were involved in murders and in different crimes where they would be called in to testify, and they had to be locked up to keep safe. So there were no good options before the Safe Harbor Act. And if you also remember, before the Safe Harbor Act, who was working with these kids? It were really paraprofessionals. It was little grassroots groups. It was little organizations that banded together because maybe they'd been abused as children, and they've set up a little storefront, and they're going to try to help. But there was no structure, there was no protocol, there was no theory behind how to treat these kids. Once DCF got involved in this, and this also goes back probably 5 or 6 years, DCF developed a protocol for identifying and treating these kids. I can probably send you the citation on it, but there is a very different way of interviewing kids. When CPIs go out to interview a child that we are possibly identifying as a human trafficking victim, they have a whole different assessment tool that they have to use. But again, it's been developed over the years because we've kind of learned what do we need to ask these kids. Before, it wasn't a CPI, it wasn't a child protective investigator, it was a DJJ worker who was identifying and trying to talk to these kids. But what were they doing? They were looking at them as youthful offenders. And once we had the Safe Harbor Act, we were able to treat them as victims. Even if they didn't identify as victims, even if they didn't believe they were victims, they were able to be treated as victims. And maybe this kind of goes back to a little bit of what Stephen was just asking about before, but the more social factors you have against you, more things that have happened in your life that were beyond your control, that shouldn't have happened to children, the more things that happened to you that prevented you from having love and care and support, the more chance you have of being trafficked. And that's why we say 1 out of every 3 kids who runs away is lured into sex trafficking within 48 hours of leaving their home. And that is documented through research. It is a very scary thing for kids. And it's very scary for me when I know that some of these kids have run and the police have not found them. And the longer they're away, the better than average chances that they're not going to be found. A few years ago, and this was, I think it was 2016, a girl at Florida United ran away. She was 16, I think. And she got into a fight with the house parent. It's kind of a typical group home story. She got into a fight with her cottage parents or house parents, whatever they were. And she ran through the woods, and where there are no lights, came out on the street over by, there's a Publix on that street. And she was standing in front of the 7-Eleven, obviously looking distressed. And this guy came up to her and said, you want me to give you a ride home? And she got in the car with him. And that's okay, Deanna. We didn't even hear it. You were fine. Diana, I think Deanna was worried that she was having a little upset in her house and that we could all hear it. We didn't hear it. Don't worry about it. But this kid, so the guy offers to pick her up. He picks her up, and he didn't take her. He took her to his home, and he raped her. And then he got on the phone with his friends, and he was going to bring people over to have sex with her. And in the meantime, he fell asleep because they were using drugs. She got out of the no problem, Deanna. She got out of his house and tried to run away. And she ran next door where there was a police car in the driveway. And the reason I know this is the police officer that was involved in this told me the story. He said she got out of the house. He had fallen asleep. She got out. It was like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. She ran next door and knocked on the door. And the police officer came to the door and was able to retrieve her and bring her to safety. But as he said to me, if my car hadn't been in that driveway, if somebody else had answered the door, she could have been in equal trouble. her chances of getting away from him were very, very slim. And it was only for the fact that whatever drug he took, he fell asleep, that she was able to get away from him. Now, why was she running? She's a kid who didn't have a lot of people in her life, and she got into a fight with her group home. So there's a tremendous vulnerability with these kids that we are all working with now, that we need to be aware of, especially if you're working with older kids that might be more prone to run. And the average lifespan is 8 years. It's really hard to get out once you get in.
Barbara, I just wanted to ask you, what happens after the 8 years?
Good question, Bonnie. I mean, really, what does happen? From what we have been able to see, and unfortunately, we live close to Daytona Beach, and Daytona Beach is an interesting area. There's an area up in South Ridgewood that is, when I used to work in Daytona Beach, I used to come down South Ridgewood in the morning to get to my office. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, you could see all the hookers going home because now their night shift was over and you could see them all walking home. There was a period of time where there was a whole serial slaying thing going on there with some, but he was finally arrested, but he was killing hookers. And there were a lot of them. This is a very dangerous life. So think about this for a minute. If you get sucked in as a child to human trafficking, you have a chance now of getting out, because we have a lot more agencies and a lot more providers that are aware of what we are looking at with you and aware of how to convince you that you are a victim and that we can help you. But I think the other thing that you have to consider is a lot of people die. And this is a dangerous way to live, and a lot of people die. You don't see a lot of aging hookers. When all this happened in Daytona Beach a few years ago, I think the oldest woman that was arrested was 50, and she looked like she was about 90. And she had been a prostitute during her adult life. She had been trafficked as a child, then got into prostitution and got into recruiting. But it takes a toll. If you look at the pictures of these people, it takes a toll. So what are we doing now differently? The child protective investigators, like I said, there's a whole tool, the whole assessment tool that they are taught to use when they're approaching these kids, because we as an agency, we as the child protective investigators have to be able to identify that these kids are victims of human trafficking. In order to get them into safe houses, in order to get them into some kind of treatment, we have to be able to figure out and assess whether or not they are in fact victims of human trafficking. And once they're identified, then we have the possibility for treatment. But they used to ask them different things, and now they're taught to ask them, do you need food? Do you need water? A lot of these kids haven't been fed. Do you need to see a doctor? When did you have your last period? Have you had any unwanted pregnancies? Have you had any abortions? Because certainly if you get pregnant, you know it's going to be aborted. Do you know where you are? Like I said, a lot of these kids don't even know what state they're in because they have been moved from place to place. They've been in cars. They haven't been allowed to talk to anybody. Do you have a pimp? If they ask, do you have a pimp, most of them will say no. If the CPI says, do you have a boyfriend? And does that boyfriend ask you to have sex for money? More than likely the CPI will get the answer. And a lot of these kids can't say where they live. They don't know where they live. And they've long since lost their identification. So when we talk about trying to work with them, these victims have trauma bonds with their traffickers. And you guys are all trauma experts, so you know what a trauma bond is. And they're often going to say, I don't need you to save me. I don't need you to help me. A lot of these kids will resist treatment. They will run away from the group homes that they're placed in. They have been taught not to trust anybody. The only one that they think is going to have any control over them is their trafficker. And when you heard those girls talk about the way they were abused by their traffickers, the second girl in that video said, once you know that he can kill you, you're going to do anything he says, because there's nobody in your corner. There's nobody that's going to stop this. Nobody is going to try to help you, including other victims, because the other victims are equally controlled by the trafficker. It's very similar to domestic violence situations that, when you're working with DV victims, what do we say about DV victims? How many times did they have to run away from their abuser before they finally get out? Anybody know? Seven. Absolutely. The average time for a DV victim is seven runs before they finally make it. And it's kind of similar here, that CSEC victims, they just don't know that in many cases, they do not know that they have been exploited, and they're afraid of their trafficker. He has or she has absolute power over them. And that is a very important thing for you as treating practitioners to be aware of. You can't challenge that trauma bond immediately. You cannot immediately say, well, he's a jerk. He's been abusing you. He's been trafficking you. Because in that moment, those words are not going to be heard. And if you watch the case studies that we put on our playlist, you're going to see that there are many attempts to rescue kids that are unsuccessful, because kids are rescued and they run away. The Texas safe house that I was talking about, that director told me that those kids ran multiple times, and that eventually she started a jogging program with them, because she would go out and jog with them, and they would try to run away, but if she could stay with them, she had a better chance of catching them. But it's a very different way of working with our victims than we're used to. And again, they cannot give consent to be sex workers. I think what you're going to see again and again and again is that we have changed dramatically with the way law enforcement deals with these kids over the years. But if you talk to anybody who was in law enforcement years ago, their perception is that these are just little baby prostitutes, and that they have made this choice, that they were given the opportunity to get out and they didn't. The Stockholm syndrome that we all are aware of, it's kind of a catchphrase for that whole trauma bonding thing, but it is very, very powerful in the human trafficking world. And the reason that pimps are so good at what they do is that they totally separate these kids from any and all supports that they have. That's why they have no money, they have no identification, they absolutely need that pimp for every single thing that they have. Food, water, medication, any kind of treatment, the pimp has to do it. And that is why they are so bonded, because without this pimp, they have nothing. And they certainly have been taught to believe that they are nothing. So our public education has gone a long way. All these human trafficking conferences and workshops that we go to all the time will repeat this over and over and over again, that it has taken us years to reach this point where we understand that no matter what this kid says to you, no matter how she says, I don't need your help, he's my boyfriend, I'm in love with him, I'm going to stay with him, you don't have to rescue me, they are still victims. When we look about, and I guess I'm going to look at Emeka for a few minutes. Emeka, if you recall, when we first were looking at this, and this probably was 2014, I'm thinking, that we began to do that study. Yes. We did not find anything that was a model for treatment. Remember, I still have all those folders. We had all these meetings, and we would look to different states that had different programs, but there was nothing. There were So you're kind of on your own trying to figure out what to do here. But I think the one thing we came out of it knowing was that there was no certified model to work with these kids.
Yes. And it's been that makes it more difficult. And thank God, you were able to come up with this to give us like lead the way as to how to manage these kids. They are suffering every single second as we speak right now. And sometimes too, we don't want to overwhelm them with questions because that will be traumatizing them again.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
it's so difficult, but we are hoping that we'll continue this, stay on this route to save as much as possible.
Well, this training was really developed as a result of the work that Emeka and I think it was Amy Iannatelli and I did together, because we really did study it, and we were kind of shocked that there was so little set in place so little models to say how do we work with these kids. And you're right, you can't overwhelm them with questions. They really do believe that they are not victims, and it has been a very different way of looking at things. One of the really good things that happened was that the CPIs developed a very different assessment tool, and instead of trying to go in and assess for whatever was going on, they went right to physical stuff. Do you need food? Do you need water? Are you sick? Do you need to see a doctor? Have you been given something to stop your periods? And it was all very physical, caretaking, nurturing kind of stuff. And that's kind of where you have to start. So it's like I said, I find this hard to do because it's so dark, and it hasn't gotten any better. The only thing that's gotten better is that we as communities have gotten a whole lot better at forming task force and putting together all these different disciplines to try to come up with ways to rescue kids at the most common events, which is NASCAR and Bike Week and Super Bowl and all of that stuff. It and it has, and there's been a lot of publicity around those stings. So, and that helps to educate people that you don't think you have to educate. Like, what did Marcia say about Uber drivers? That Uber drivers, of course, would be involved in something like that, or people who work at the Holiday Inn, or at any of those cheesy hotels up and down Ridgewood during Bike Week, all would really need to be aware of what they were looking at. So what we do know is that they can't consent. And what we do know is that there's not a lot of shelter and services for these kids. But the biggest thing that Emeka and Amy and I came up with was that there's just no single best practice model. There just isn't. I think we have learned that we have to start with very basic nurturant types of activities. And even sitting a kid down, I mean, we're therapists. We're used to the usual trauma narrative, blah, blah, blah. What happened to you? Yada. And you can't do that with these kids.
Yes. Barbara, can I add something?
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say too, in addition to what you said, is the nurturing aspect of it is so critical because it can go both ways. They may be thinking, okay, you are nurturing me right now. What do you want from me? And then the
Yeah.
transference issues would start. So it has to be it's a delicate, line and process. We have to be very, very careful because we are trying to do opposite of what the pimps have been doing for them, but in a genuine manner. So they wouldn't misunderstand or misconstrue that as, okay, you want to have sex with me, or you want to, something like that. So it's so critical to be watchful and be alert as to how we proceed to help these young people that are suffering.
That's a really, really good point. And it's kind of, Deanne saying how young is too young to educate our children. I don't know that it's ever too young. If you've listened to any of this stuff that we're talking about, you look at babies in the Publix and with their tablets in front of them. So I don't know that there's ever a time that you would not begin to educate your children about especially the dangers of social media, because little tiny kids are on different websites. I mean, we know that there are websites that are supposed to be geared to young children, but if you look at that thing that Marina Anderson did, you'll see that there's all kinds of disguises in these apps that you have to be ever vigilant about what kinds of things your kids are on. Because let's face it, you can have your 6-year-old think that he's playing with another 6-year-old in China and saying, isn't this fun, Mom? I got this friend in China, and it's a 50-year-old guy in the next town trying to recruit. So yeah, I don't know that it's ever too early. I don't know that our governor would agree, but we're not going to get into that today, are we? So
well, I
that's
educated
a subject
my
for another
children at a very young age.
day.
But
Say that again.
to tell her, I educated my children at a very young age, but for our clients, um, some of them may ask it, how old is too young.
Is that
So
Bonnie?
that's why
I can't tell who's talking.
it's Deanna.
Oh, Deanna. Okay, Deanna. I'm sorry. Say that again, Deanna.
I said I educated all 4 of my children at a very young age, but some clients may not. They may feel that a certain age is too young to educate our children. So that's why I asked that question.
Well, and I think the response really has to do with your own kids. We are working with parents, we're all working with parents who may absolutely have no knowledge of this.
Right.
And I think when you really think about it, who are you starting to educate? You're really starting to educate parents. I mean, how do these kids get into the situations they get into right in front of their parents' eyes? Because their parents are not aware of what's happening. I think some of these are in my YouTube playlist, but there is one where the kid is sitting at the table. She's probably 13, 14 years old. She's sitting at the table and she's on her tablet and she's talking to the pimp who's waiting outside in the car for her. And her mother says, well, who are you talking to? And she said, oh, my girlfriend, and gets up and leaves and goes away with the pimp. And a lot of those things kind of depict parents who just, we're in the field. We talk about this stuff all the time. This is not foreign to us. But to somebody who is working in a dollar store and just trying to, raise her kids and just trying to be a good parent, the whole world isn't aware of this stuff. So the more public education we do to parents, that's where you got to start. Deanna sounds like you've got 4 kids and you're educating them, but you're an educator. You're in the field. You're aware of all this stuff. You see clients that have been sucked into this stuff. The average mom or dad does not know this. So just helping to educate our parents is helpful. Carol, did you want to say something? If you do, you don't have audio. Carol's on a new computer. So let's hope we're not going to have sound problems, Carol.
I've noticed that seems like the culture that these kids are involved in the trafficking world is very similar to a lot of the culture that's found in gangs.
Mm-hmm. Well, think about that, Stephen. How do people get into gangs? What's the lure for anybody to get into a gang where the world is going to be violent, the world is going to be unforgiving? I mean, why do especially boys, why do boys gravitate to gangs? Usually it's because they started where some of these kids have started. You go to a gang because you want a family. You go to a gang because you want to have a quotes family to take care of you. And there's a high price to pay for being in a gang. We're not talking about West Side Story and the Sharks and the whatever they were, Jets. The world of gangs is very dangerous, but boys get sucked into gangs because usually they don't have people at home, they don't have parents, they don't have somebody that can nurture them, and that's the appeal of a gang. That's the appeal of a gang for girls, because girls think that they are going to be accepted, and they're not. They think that they're going to be a member of a family. I mean, what do gangs kind of preach? That we are family. And that's why we have our colors, we have our hand signals, we have our lingo, and only we have that lingo, and only we have that color, because we are a family and everybody else is outside and we're in. So you're right, Stephen, it's kind of the same thing. It's the same lure. So we have to start somewhere, and that's kind of what we're looking at here. We have to start, and whether you have your own agency, whether you're a part of Circle of Friends, when we are doing any of these things, we always kind of start with the fact that the programs have got to be victim-centered and they've got to be strength-based. We have to make sure. Okay, all right, hold on, because Carol still is having trouble with her sound, but I think she wants to say something, so let me see. Oh my God. All right, Carol says, a child's monitor in their room was intercepted by an outsider. They had asked the child if they liked ice cream and to come to the door for ice cream. Luckily, the child didn't go, began crying, and the parents came to him for comfort. Holy God.
That is true. They do intercept like home devices, baby monitors, baby cameras, Alexa device, like all of those.
Right.
Anything like that, they can get into.
Yeah, Lisa is just saying that to go along with what this Carol story here, that you can intercept things like your Alexa device or your baby monitor. I mean, the world is a very different place than it was. So, and I'm going to go back to a comment that Deanna made about some parents think that they shouldn't educate their children too early. Probably have to start with educating the parents. I mean, I don't want people to go around being afraid to have their kids out of their sight. That's not the world we want to live in. But we do want to make sure that we've done what we can to protect our kids from things that we didn't think we had to protect them from before. I would also say this is not work for beginning therapists. Not everything is work for beginning therapists. Lisa and I interviewed a young lady yesterday, and we're talking to her about, you know, how she did her work, and I think we could see that she may have been young, but she had a certain base from which to start. She had a good trauma base. She understood how she had to approach clients. When you first come out of your graduate program, unless you are a genius, you don't have that experience. You have to learn how to do it. And that's why we do all these trainings, because we want you to learn how to approach these kids. We want you to learn how to be therapeutically strong. You certainly have to understand gang dynamics. And it kind of goes along with what Stephen and I were just talking about. You have to understand, how do kids get sucked into gangs? How do girls get sucked into gangs when they're not going to be treated well? How do people respond to the guy who, like with this girl, when he said you're model material, and I'd like to do a shoot with you? And she was very flattered by that, because if you really look at that video, she was she had bad skin, she had kind of straggly hair, she wasn't model material, but he was flattering her. And you have to be sensitive to all of that in order to work with these kids. And again, that's why we try to do these trainings to help you, because it's not easy work. You have to be looking for the clues. And any of these things, when you're working with kids, any of these things are clues to the fact that they probably have a history of trafficking. We have a sexual trauma team, And sometimes when we get these cases in through the sexual trauma team, you can see that probably there has been either an attempt to traffic or trafficked, kids that have been trafficked, but they don't come in with that in the intake. That isn't what the case manager tells Angie when she calls to make the referral. So we have to kind of be on the lookout for it when we're trying to assess kids. Because if you're assessing a victim of child sexual abuse from a father, from an uncle, from whatever, you're looking at family disruptions, you're looking at just kind of the confusion of what is the role of my father as opposed to the role that my father played. But when you're looking for CSEC victims, when you're looking for the possibility that your client has been trafficked, you're looking for that kind of disruption of trust that's very different. You're looking to go back to what Emeka said, you're looking for transference that might be happening because now you're a good therapist. You're going to offer kindness, you're going to offer support, you're going to offer safety. And might your CSEC victim then say, well, then you want to have sex with me too? You have to be kind of aware of the different mentality of kids who have had a history of just being brutalized over and over and over again. And the only person that stands between them and death is their boyfriend or their pimp or their alleged boyfriend. So it's a little bit slower work. It doesn't mean that you don't do it. It just means that it can't be forced. It takes a little bit longer. One of the things that we've looked at, there's the program in Miami, Citrus. One of the things that she talked about, the woman that ran that program, I think she's still there, is that they started doing a whole lot of things that had nothing to do with therapy. They started doing yoga classes. They started doing jogging. They started doing things that had nothing to do with therapy, just to give those kids a chance to deactivate their sympathetic nervous system and activate their parasympathetic and begin to feel a little bit of safety. The challenges of doing this is that these kids are going to keep running away. So that makes the traditional Medicaid model almost impossible to follow. So what happened, and Lisa mentioned Devereaux at the break, Devereaux got the grant, a grant a few years ago to develop CSEC services, and they've done a very good job with that grant. They have, actually, I get them invitations every month. They have monthly meetings. You can call into their meetings. Anybody can call in and you can talk about whatever client you might have, or you can hear other people who are working in other agencies that have human trafficking clients. So it's kind of a good group share, and they run that monthly. I think what we see through that what's it called, Delta, the Delta program, that there's a lot of group support among the therapists because it's tough work, and we need to be able to talk to other people to see how are other people doing with this, because it can be very difficult to develop a therapeutic bond with these kids. And it's like I said before, you can't immediately say, okay, this guy's a dirtbag. He's terrible, he's horrible, he's awful. Don't you know what he did to you? He's abused you. Because if you do that, you might push them a whole lot farther away from you. You have to allow them to come to it themselves. Very similar in a way to those of you who've done a lot of sexual trauma work with just incest or family abuse. There are a lot of incest victims who have absolutely no idea that they are incest victims until a helping professional gradually helps them to understand what normal, healthy sexual relationships are. But if you have grown up in a family where your father had sex with everybody, then you're not going to know any different. Those of you who came to the sexual trauma treatment, I don't even know when we did that training. One of the videos that we show in that training is a girl who lived in an incest family who said, I thought everybody did this. I thought everybody lived like this. And it's kind of similar to working with these kids. It's slow. They may not perceive themselves as a victim. and it may be tough for you to develop a bond. So you go slow. That's why the Medicaid model is a little tough. Since in the Medicaid model, we got 45 days to get this treatment plan nailed down, and that's not usually going to happen. So if we're not going to be able to work with therapeutic models, what do we do? You know, those of you who have gone to the Gentry training, the 10 core competencies, and we talk about, Eric Gentry is always saying you cannot experience threat in a relaxed body. You can't experience trauma in a relaxed body. If you believe that you're in the here and now and you're safe, then you can look at what's happened in your past. The problem with our kids when they come in is that they don't have any safety zone in their brains. Their safety zones have to be reset. They're always on high alert. And you know that from just garden variety, if we can call it that, traumatized kids that you work with every day. That kids who have been traumatized repeatedly don't feel safe. They're always on high alert. They're always looking for the next danger. They're, when we say the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system is what activates your stress and your fear. Your parasympathetic allows you to relax and perceive safety. So part of what we have to do with these kids is really doing a lot of sensory stuff. And that doesn't mean telling the story. The trauma narrative that you've heard me say, we don't always have to do a trauma narrative. It isn't about telling their story. Number one, they're not going to tell you the story. And if they tell it to you, it's not going to be the truth. So we're going to look at sensory techniques. One, and I can say this from the Citrus program, and I learned this from the program in Texas, that a lot of sensory techniques just work way better than immediately sitting down and trying to do a trauma narrative. After 9/11 happened, these were the 5 things that victims said was most helpful to them was yoga, jogging, massage, EMDR, and acupuncture. Those were the things that people after 9/11 said, these are the most helpful things to me in recovering from the initial trauma of 9/11. Now, if you look at those things, none of those have anything to do with therapy. I mean, we do a little yoga stuff with our kids, but these are all very sensory things. These are all things that allow our kids to kind of calm down, maybe feel some sense of safety with you. Well, obviously you're not going to do acupuncture, but most of you probably could get into a rudimentary yoga pose if you had to. Some of you could jog. Depends on what you could do. I can tell you that the Texas program said that the jogging program was the most successful. That with some of these kids, they jogged with them for 2-3 months before they were able to do anything else. The yoga classes were very popular. Even though the yoga classes, there's certain yoga poses that you have to be aware of that might be triggering. But basic yoga, basic centering, meditation, calming types of things are usually pretty helpful with these kids. And I say that for the initial stages because, again, this is going to be slower work. It helps to not be bound to the Medicaid model, and I know that we are for the most part. We've also found ways to try to work through some of this stuff with some of the grants that we have now, but it can be very slow, and you really have to get them through the stages where they really are wondering. I think Emeka said it, what do you want from me? You're going to be nice to me, what do you want from me? So doing some sensory stuff is really a little bit more important than some of the other things. And you're just going to have to avoid passing judgment. And it really is hard. It's very hard because we're looking at these kids and we see a 14, a 15, a 12-year-old girl, a 12-year-old boy who has been so brutalized and so hurt. And you're there and you're therapists. You want to help. All therapists want to help. That's what we do. But it may have to be done in a different way. We don't have a ton of programs developed in Florida right now for these, for safe houses. Safe houses have a whole law around them, and you have to have certain things in order to have a safe house. There was some discussion about putting a safe house into a program that's up in Madison, which is right on the Georgia border, that would have probably had everything a safe house needed, because it was geographically isolated from a lot of places, which is helpful, because if you're running, if you don't have to run for a whole long time, it's better. But there's not a lot of money. And the state has kind of developed a protocol and a law around safe houses, so, which is all fine, but it really has limited the amount of services that we can provide to these kids. But when you are working with them, all I would say is that you have to make sure that your victim sees you as a point of refuge, and that may take a while. It's just not something that's going to happen overnight. Special considerations for male victims. Think about male victims for a little bit. And I don't know what the breakout is. I did at one point, but I don't want to tell you because I might say it wrong. I did know at one point what the percentage of male and female, and it's higher for male than you might think. But the mode of work is different for the male victims. I mean, for one thing, the gay males are going to have an additional level of confusion, because male victims are often they have more violent encounters. There's a lot more. It's a lot more difficult a world for the male victims, and gay males are more apt to look for internet hookup sites. They're looking for some kind of connection. So the connection that they're looking for is often not what they think it is, and then they have become equally victimized. So, and a lot of boys, because boys are groomed differently than girls and will probably always be groomed differently than girls, most boys think that they have made this choice. It's very hard for a boy to say, oh yeah, I was victimized. And boys are much more apt to say, you know, I did this to survive. I did this because I needed money. I did it because I needed food. But in reality, they have been victimized, and they've been recruited just like girls. And there are very, very few shelters for male victims. We don't find them the way we do for girls. And I believe, under the radar, sexual exploitation of young men, I believe that is a paper. It's been so long since I looked at that particular thing, but I believe it's a position paper that you can Google and find about the sexual exploitation of boys. But boys, again, especially gay boys, are going to have all of that confusion that goes along with everything else that's mixed up in their world. And oh my gosh, I say oh my gosh because I just sent Carol and Lisa this morning yet another article from the paper, or from the Tampa Times, about the whole LGBT thing, and how the Florida Department of Health is now saying that we're not supposed to talk to them, and we're not supposed to use names and pronouns, and all of this kind of stuff that I don't even know where any of this is going. But it is something that I would have to say, because it is so current and it's just happened, that those of you who are working with LGBT victims have got to be really aware of some of what's happening in our political system right now. But the federal guidelines for working with trans victims and what Florida is saying you should do with trans victims are two very different things. So those choices you're going to have to make within your agency or with your agency, in terms of how you work with these kids. But LGBT victims are also in a whole different category of work. They're very, very vulnerable to survival sex. And they may think that this is their choice. They may think that this is how they are surviving. You got to remember, a lot of these kids have been kicked out of their homes. A lot of them are homeless. So if you're homeless, you're going to do what you can to survive. And we have to, I don't care what the Florida thing says, we have to respect the use of names and pronouns. And when you're working with a trans youth, you've got to be aware of where do they see themselves. Excuse me. So let's learn a little bit from the domestic violence movement. The only intervention we had with the DV population was shelter. We put them in shelters, and they left shelters and went back to their husbands or their boyfriends. And it really has never addressed the core issue for domestic violence. And domestic violence victims, I think Bonnie said it, they have to leave at least 7 times before they feel like they are safe. I know, I didn't see it, but I know there was a series on Netflix called The Maid. And I only know about it because somebody told me about it, about how difficult it was for the character in that series to get away from her abusive husband, to fight the system that was against her, to finally be able to break free from all of this. And it's the same with the CSEC population. They're going to need somebody to help them. They're going to need some sense of safety because they can't get out of the life otherwise. We can be a part of that, but we can only be a part of it. And I think we have to, Lisa, did you know you said that? Sorry, Lisa hasn't seen this slide yet. We have a program called the Intensive Treatment Program. And those kids, they run. They're older kids in foster care. And our primary purpose of setting up the Intensive Treatment Program was to prevent placement disruptions. But the very first kid that we had that came into that program had over 60 placement disruptions when we got him. Now that kid did continue to run, but when he ran, he called his therapist. And that's why I'm quoting Lisa from something she doesn't remember she said. But we considered that a mark of success because when he ran, he would call his therapist, and she remained his lifeline throughout the time that we had with him. So we have to look at how we're defining success with these kids. They may run several times trying to go back to what they know. We have to be able to respond to these challenges with these kids. We look at what we're going to look for success. We may redefine our success. If this kid has run away from a safe house, has he or she made any attempt to contact the therapist? Did they come back on their own? Did the amount of time that they spent running, did it increase or decrease? Were they willing when they came back to tell the therapist where they were? It's defining success with these kids in a different way. And maybe we learned that a little bit through the intensive treatment program, but it's the same with these kids. If they have a positive relationship with you as a therapist, they may still believe that this guy is their boyfriend. They may still believe that they are not victimized. But the more positive you can develop a relationship with a kid, the better chance you have of cutting through that to some kind of reality. And it's no different than any of your other kids that you work with. And that's why I say you got to start somewhere. There is no evidence-based treatment model. That's why we kind of got in there and said, what could we do? What could we try to do? Could we try taking a risk as long as we're not doing something wrong? The whole yoga thing, the exercise thing, is something that we've seen that it does help. It helps kids to relax. Jogging, running, drawing, arts and crafts. It doesn't have to be anything terribly therapeutic. We just have to be able to try and take some risks. We don't let you guys do anything that would be counterproductive to treatment. but sometimes we have to kind of look at the way we define treatment. And sometimes it's just a lot slower. And I think that is it. Comments from anybody?
I have a comment. I think it's important to, like, Shanice and our last staffing made a comment that she gives one of the kids she works with like 15 minutes to talk about like what's going on in her world. And I think that speaks to listening to our kids, because you want to be able to pick up on these things. Are they talking about boys or girls or whoever they're dating?
Right.
What does that, so we can kind of hear, because they're not aware that it's unsafe or not, but it will give you some insight as to what they are experiencing outside of the home.
Yeah, I don't know how much you could hear Lisa because she's kind of far away from the microphone, but she was saying that one of the therapists gives her kid that she's working with about 15 minutes at the beginning of a session to just sort of talk about what's happening and what happened in their world. And they're talking about boys, are they talking about girls? What are they talking about? It's the same as we're talking about if you know the lingo, if you know the language, if you can pick up on the things that they're saying because they're just talking to you. If they're still talking about their boyfriend when he's their pimp, it'll give you a whole lot more insight into how you can help some of these kids. You just have to meet them where they are. And it isn't easy work. I mean, I don't think that it is. And when we get kids here that usually have come in through the sexual trauma treatment program and then kind of find out through looking at the history that this probably was a kid that was trafficked, then we have to look at a different way of working with them. Anybody else want to say anything while we're here? Okay. Do we know who these two, caller number 1 and caller number 2 are? Have we figured that out? I see caller number 1 and caller number 2. I just want to make sure I give you credit because I do not who.
Cynthia.
One is Cynthia. Is the other one Deanna maybe? Yes. Okay.
Yes,
all right.
Cynthia Freeborn.
Okay. All right. I will be doing the CEUs probably tomorrow morning and the credits. And Deanna, are you licensed? Are you needing CEUs? All right. Deanna, if you need CEUs, you need to let me know what your license number is. Emeka, I can look up.
Thank you.
And the rest of you, we will be doing the training credits tomorrow morning. And I thank you all for coming. I know that it is not the most uplifting way to spend 3 hours of your Thursday morning, but it's a pretty unuplifting world that these kids have come from. So thank you all, and I appreciate it. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Bye.
So long.
Bye.
Bye, Barbara. Thanks.
So long, Cynthia.
Take care.
Deanna is asking if they will have access to the recording. When we figure out how to have access to the recording, I think we can make that happen. We're just learning how to do this, Deanna. All right, here we go.